there is a stone bridge in the hills of northern Pennsylvania that was finished in 1848, 13 years before the Civil War. Freight trains still roll across it today. Not a preserved bridge, not a monument behind a fence. A working railroad bridge, carrying real freight, more than 170 years after the last block of stone was set. It is called the Staruka Viaduct. It is 1,040 feet of bluestone, standing on 17 great arches, 100 feet above a quiet creek near the village of Lanesboro. When it was built, it was the most expensive railroad bridge anyone in America had ever paid for, and a lot of people thought the company was mad to build a thing so permanent for a business so new. They were not mad, they were right. The trains are still crossing. I have been reading the engineering histories of the New York and Erie Railroad and the records of this viaduct, and as always I want to begin with the two men whose names the record actually kept, because the hundreds who cut and lifted the stone are mostly remembered only as a number. The first name is Julius Walker Adams. He was born in Boston in 1812, and he was a born engineer in an age that barely had the profession yet. He went to West Point at 18, but left after 2 years to learn the trade the practical way, working under his uncle, a famous engineer named George Washington Whistler. By his 30s, Adams had worked on railroads and water systems up and down the Northeast, and when the New York and Erie needed someone to design a stone bridge bigger than any in the country, the job came to him. Adams drew the Staruka Viaduct, and the rest of his life tells you what kind of mind he had. He would go on to design the first great city sewer system in America for Brooklyn, and to write the first American textbook on how to drain a city. He helped found the American Society of Civil Engineers and served as its president. He even sat on the panel of experts that reviewed John Roebling's plans for the Brooklyn Bridge. The man who designed this Pennsylvania viaduct was one of the people who invented American civil engineering as a profession. The second name is James Pugh Kirkwood. Kirkwood was a Scotsman born in Edinburgh in 1807 who had come to America and become one of its most capable builders. When the Erie needed someone not to design the viaduct but to actually build it, on a brutal schedule in a remote valley, Adams said there was only one man he trusted with it. In one telling of the story, Adams said he knew of no one who could do it unless it was Kirkwood, and Kirkwood gave an answer that ought to be carved over the door of every great public work ever built. He said, "I can build that viaduct in time, provided you do not care how much it cost." One sentence is the whole story of the Staruka Viaduct. They wanted it fast, and they wanted it to last forever, and Kirkwood told them plainly that they could have both, but it would cost whatever it cost. These are our anchors: Adams, who designed it; Wood, who built it, and who warned them about the bill. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. To understand why a young railroad would spend a fortune on a single bridge, you have to understand the desperate, dramatic thing the New York and Erie Railroad was trying to do in the 1840s. It was trying to build the longest railroad in the world. The Erie was chartered all the way back in 1832 to run clear across the southern tier of New York State, from the Hudson River, near New York City, all the way west to Lake Erie, hundreds of miles through some of the roughest country in the Northeast, a land of deep valleys, fast rivers, and forested mountains. For years the project crawled. It ran out of money again and again, fought the terrain mile by mile, and its costs ballooned until people had begun to call the whole thing hopeless. By the time the line reached northeastern Pennsylvania, it was the better part of 2 decades into a job that had nearly died a dozen times. Everything depended on pushing through to the lake, and everything between the end of track and the lake was an obstacle to be beaten. And one of the worst obstacles on the whole route was a deep, wide valley where a creek called the Staruka had cut a gorge straight across the path of the railroad. This is wild, beautiful country, the far northeastern corner of Pennsylvania, where the Staruka Creek runs down to meet the Susquehanna River near the little settlement of Lanesboro, in the county that takes the river's name. It is hill country, steep and forested, the kind of land that had stopped roads and canals before the railroad ever came. The valley the Erie had to cross here was not a gentle dip. It was a real gorge, wide and deep, and there was no way around it that did not throw the whole carefully held grade of the railroad off its line. Here is the problem a valley like that poses to a railroad, and it is the same problem in every one of these stories. A railroad cannot climb and dive the way a road can. A locomotive hauling a heavy train can only manage the gentlest of grades, so the track has to stay nearly level, which means that when the line meets a valley, you cannot simply run the rails down one side and up the other. You have to carry the track straight across the gap at height, holding the grade. The Staruka Valley was about 1,000 feet wide where the railroad had to cross it, and the floor of it lay about 100 feet below the level the track needed to hold. The Erie had to build a bridge 1,000 feet long and 100 feet tall, strong enough to carry the heaviest trains of the age, across a Pennsylvania creek in the middle of nowhere, and it had to do it fast. The whole half-finished railroad behind it was waiting to push west to the lake. Now I have to introduce the choice that makes this bridge special, and I want you with me at the boss tier while I do, for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to the valley. The cheap, fast, ordinary way to cross a valley with a railroad in 1848 was to build a timber trestle, a tall framework of wooden beams. Timber was everywhere, it went up quickly, and it was far cheaper than stone. Almost every railroad crossing of that era was a wooden trestle. The trouble with timber is that it rots, it burns, and it has to be replaced over and over again, every couple of decades, forever. The Erie's engineers looked at the Staruka crossing and made a different decision. They would not build it out of wood, build it out of stone. A masonry arch viaduct like the great aqueducts of the Romans, a structure that would never burn and would barely age. It was the expensive choice, the slow choice that made Kirkwood warn them about the bill. But it was the choice that is the reason trains still cross it today, and not a single replacement trestle has ever been needed. You can see why this railroad in particular would not gamble its grandest crossing on wood. The Erie had bled too much money and waited too many years to risk its most spectacular bridge to rot and fire. The company had nearly gone under more than once just trying to get this far. If they were going to cross the Staruka, were going to cross it once, in stone, and never have to think about it again. What they built is a thing of real beauty, and the engineering of it is worth walking through slowly. The Staruka Viaduct is a line of 17 stone arches, each one spanning 50 feet, marching across the valley on tall piers. End to end it runs 1,040 feet, and at its highest it stands about 100 feet above the creek. The deck across the top is around 25 feet wide, broad enough to carry two tracks side by side, which was far-sighted for 1848. The stone is a local Pennsylvania bluestone, a hard bluish-gray sandstone, quarried right there in the surrounding hills and laid up as what masons call random ashlar, squared blocks fitted together without a regular pattern. The numbers behind it are staggering for handwork. The viaduct contains something over 21,000 cubic yards of masonry. The individual stones run from 9 to 18 inches thick. To build the 17 arches, the crews first had to erect a small forest of wooden falsework, temporary timber centering to hold each arch up until its keystone was set, using by some accounts more than 500,000 feet of timber just for the scaffolding that would later be torn back down. It is worth understanding how you build a stone arch at all, because it is a small act of faith every single time. An arch is not strong until it is complete. Until the last stone, the keystone, is dropped into the very top, an arch is just two leaning half-arches that want to fall into the gap between them. So for every one of the 17 arches, the crews first built a curved wooden framework called the centering, spanning the 50-foot gap between two piers. On top of that wooden curve, they laid the cut bluestone, block by block, working up from both sides toward the middle, timber holding the whole arch in the air. Only when the keystone was finally driven home, at the very top did the arch become self-supporting, each stone pressing against its neighbors, the whole curve locking itself together under its own weight. Then, and only then, could the men knock the wooden centering loose and slide it along to build the next arch. 17 times they did this, 17 acts of faith in stone, 100 feet above the creek. There is one more detail in this bridge that engineers still talk about, and it is a quiet little first. To found the great piers solidly in the valley floor, the builders set their pier bases on concrete, with a natural cement, quarried at a place called Rosendale in New York. Concrete is so ordinary now that we forget somebody had to use it first, and by a number of accounts, the concrete in the foundations of the Staruka Viaduct may have been the first structural use of concrete in an American bridge. I have to be careful with that claim because the sources hedge it, and so will I. It may have been the first. What is certain is that it was very early enough that this remote Pennsylvania viaduct sits near the beginning of the story of concrete in American construction, the material that would eventually build almost everything. That Rosendale cement, made from a special limestone that would set hard even underwater, became one of the great building materials of the century. It would go into the foundations of landmarks like the Brooklyn Bridge and the base of the Statue of Liberty. And here it was, early in its story, holding up the piers of a railroad viaduct in a Pennsylvania valley. The Staruka Viaduct sits at a crossroads of building history, hand-cut stone of the old Roman kind, resting on the new artificial stone that would build the modern world, past and the future fitted together in the foundations of one bridge. All of this was done in about a single year. Let that land. A 1,000-foot stone bridge, 100 feet tall, 17 hand-cut arches, over 20,000 cubic yards of masonry, founded on early concrete, was quarried, hauled, and laid up in roughly 12 months in 1847 and 1848 to meet the railroad's deadline. The reason it cost so much is the same reason it was finished so fast. The Erie threw money and men at it without stinting, exactly as Kirkwood had warned them they would have to. When the accounts were settled, the viaduct had cost on the order of $320,000, a staggering sum for one bridge in the 1840s, and by reputation the most expensive railroad bridge built anywhere in the world up to that time. That number is worth translating, because it means nothing on its own. In the 1840s, $320,000 was a fortune, more than many entire railroads cost to build, spent on a single bridge across a single creek. There were people who thought the Erie had lost its mind, that no railroad bridge could possibly justify that kind of money, that the company should have thrown up a wooden trestle for a tenth of the price and moved on. And in the short run, those critics had a point. The cheap trestle would have carried the same trains the same year for a fraction of the cost. The Erie's engineers were not building for that year. They were building for the next 100 years, and they understood something the critics did not, which is that the cheapest bridge and the least expensive bridge are not the same thing. The least expensive bridge is the one you build once and never replace. Spread that $320,000 across 170 years of unbroken service, and it may be the best bargain in the history of American railroading. Before I tell you who actually did the work, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old engineering stories like this one unless enough people click. One click, and then come right back, because here is the part the cost figure hides. $320,000 did not lay a single stone. Men laid the stones, and the records are clear enough about who those men were, even if they are silent about almost every individual name. The masonry of the Staruka Viaduct was built by a workforce of around 800 laborers, most of them Irish immigrants, paid roughly $1 a day. It is worth remembering where those Irishmen had just come from. The late 1840s were the years of the Great Famine in Ireland. Potato crop failed, and more than 1 million people died, and millions more fled across the Atlantic with nothing. Many of them landed in America and went straight to the hardest, lowest paid, most dangerous work the country had to offer, which in those years meant digging canals and building railroads. The men who raised the Staruka Viaduct were, many of them, refugees from one of the worst catastrophes of the century, who had crossed an ocean to escape starvation and then spent their days 100 feet in, air-setting bluestone for $1. Picture the work of cutting that stone too. Bluestone is a hard, dense sandstone, and every one of the thousands of blocks in the viaduct had to be quarried out of the surrounding hills and then squared and dressed by hand, with hammer and chisel and steel until it fit. There were no stone-cutting machines worth the name. A mason would study the grain of the rock, score his line, and split and dress the block by eye and by feel, the way masons had done since the time of the Egyptians. The dressed stone had to be hauled to the bridge, lifted onto the rising arches, and bedded just so 100 feet up. Multiply that by the thousands of stones and 21,000 cubic yards of masonry, and you begin to feel the sheer quantity of skilled hand labor standing in that valley. The viaduct is not just heavy, it is detailed. Every visible face of it was shaped by a man with a chisel, built the way the Romans would have recognized, because in 1848, the basic art of the stone arch had not changed in 2,000 years. The Romans built their aqueducts and their bridges out of stone arches founded on solid piers, and many of them stand to this day across Europe. Adams and Kirkwood were doing the same thing the Roman engineers had done, the same physics, and very nearly the same tools in a Pennsylvania valley in the railroad age. The difference was the deadline and the load. The Romans had centuries and the labor of the enslaved. The Erie had 1 year 800 Irishmen, and a railroad behind it demanding to go west. To house and feed that many men in a remote valley, the company threw up rough work camps along the creek, and the men lived there through the build, in the heat and the cold, doing some of the most dangerous work there was. Handling tons of stone on chains and timber false work 100 feet up is deadly work, and a snapped rope or a shifted block could kill a man in a heartbeat. The record does not give us a careful count of who died building the Staruka viaduct, which is its own kind of answer. Men were hurt and men were killed raising it, and most of them are as nameless as the stones. We do have one name from among all those men, and I want to say it because it is rare to have any. Lead stonemason is recorded as a man named Thomas Heavey, an Irish immigrant said to have come from County Offaly. I will flag honestly that his name rests on a thin record, so I hold it lightly. But it is one name out of 800, and the other 799 are exactly the men this channel exists to remember. The ledger gives them a number and a daily wage, and then it lets them disappear. Many of them are buried in graves, the record never marked. Every arch of that viaduct is their work. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. Viaduct was finished late in 1848, and the trains began to cross. Within a few years, the rest of the Erie was complete, and in 1851 the line reached Dunkirk on Lake Erie, finishing the longest railroad in the world and tying the Hudson River to the Great Lakes by iron. When it was done, the country treated the Erie as one of the wonders of the age, because that is what it was. In the middle of May, 1851, the railroad threw a celebration that ran for 3 days. President Millard Fillmore himself came, along with his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, the greatest orator in America, and something like 300 senators, congressmen, governors, officials. They rode the first through train the length of the line, from the Hudson River out to Lake Erie, behind brass bands and under banners, and Daniel Webster, who wanted nothing between himself and the scenery, had a rocking chair bolted to the deck of an open flat car and rode the whole way through the mountains in it, sitting in the open air watching the country roll by. Somewhere on that journey, the presidential train crossed the Storuca Viaduct, rolling 100 feet above the creek on the bluestone arches that had been finished only 2.5 years before. Most powerful men in the United States crossed this bridge in the first days of its life, and it has been carrying trains across that valley ever since. The Storuca Viaduct, out in its quiet valley, became one of the most admired structures in the country. People came to look at it. It was so beautiful, line of pale stone arches striding across a green Pennsylvania valley, that it became a subject for artists. In 1865, the great Hudson River school painter Jasper Cropsey painted it, a glowing autumn scene with the Susquehanna Valley spread out in fall color and a Erie train trailing white smoke as it crosses the viaduct in the distance. The painting hangs in a museum today. It is one of the few times in American art where the hero of a great painting is a railroad bridge, the machine and the mountains, sharing the canvas in peace. That is how much this viaduct impressed the people who saw it when it was new. There is something deeper in that Cropsey painting than just a pretty view, and it is worth a moment. In the middle of the 1800s, Americans were wrestling with what the railroad meant. Here was this loud smoking, iron machine driving straight through the wild and beautiful country that the same Americans had only recently learned to love. Many feared the machine would ruin the country it crossed, and then a painter looked at the Storuca Viaduct and saw something else, a man-made thing so well-proportioned, so calm and permanent, that it did not fight the valley but settled into it, pale arches as much at home in the scene as the river and the hills. The viaduct became for a while the proof that American engineering could be beautiful, that the works of the new industrial age did not have to be ugly scars on the land. A stone bridge in Pennsylvania quietly answered one of the great questions of its century, and it answered it by simply being lovely as well as useful, and then it just kept working. That is the part that still amazes me. Most of the famous structures of the 1840s are gone or preserved as museums, or carrying a fraction of their old load. The Storuca Viaduct is still a working piece of mainline railroad. The trains rolling across it now are not light wooden cars behind a little, smoking engine like the one in Cropsey's painting. They are modern freight trains, far heavier than anything Adams and Kirkwood ever imagined, run today by a railroad called the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Overtrack, owned by one of the giant modern lines. Something like half a dozen freight trains a week still cross the bluestone arches that 800 Irishmen raised before the Civil War. It is, reputation, the oldest stone arch railroad bridge still in use in all of Pennsylvania, and one of the oldest still working anywhere in the United States. Stop and compare that to how we build now. A modern highway bridge is often designed for a service life of 50 years, sometimes 75, after which it is expected to be torn down and replaced. The Storuca Viaduct passed 75 years of service before the First World War was over, past 100 years before the 1950s, and is well past 170 now, carrying loads many times heavier than the trains it was designed for. It has stood through floods and storms that destroyed lesser bridges all around it, through the rise and fall of the whole American railroad industry, through the coming of steel and concrete and the automobile, and it has needed no replacement and no deep rebuilding. The men of 1848 simply built it correctly, out of the right material, and then it kept its end of the bargain for the better part of 2 centuries. As for the 2 men, went on to remarkable careers that proved the viaduct was no fluke. Julius Adams, the designer, became one of the founding figures of American civil engineering. He designed Brooklyn's pioneering sewer system, wrote the first American treatise on draining a city, helped start the American Society of Civil Engineers, and lived until 1899, long enough to see the profession he helped create remake the country. James Kirkwood, the builder, the Scotsman who had warned them about the cost, went on to run the Erie Railroad, then to serve as chief engineer of a Great Western Railroad, and then to take charge of the waterworks of the city of St. Louis. There he became a pioneer of clean drinking water, writing a landmark study of how to filter river water through beds of sand that became a standard text, so that he is sometimes called a father of slow sand filtration. He too helped lead the American Society of Civil Engineers. Think about that for a moment. The 2 men who built a stone bridge in a Pennsylvania valley went on between them to help give American cities both their sewers and their clean water. The viaduct was where they proved what they could do. Tells you something about that first generation of American engineers, that the same handful of men turn up again and again, building the bridges, then the sewers, then the waterworks, then the great suspension spans, learning on each job and carrying what they learned to the next. Were not many of them. And the country was building everything at once. So a man who proved himself on a stone viaduct in 1848 might find himself, 20 years later, deciding how a great city would drink and drain. Adams and Kirkwood were exactly those men. The Staruka Viaduct was not the end of anything for them. It was an early proof, a place where 2 young engineers showed that they could take an impossible specification, 1,000 feet across, 100 feet up 1 year, to last forever, and actually deliver it. Much of what they did afterward rested on the bluestone they laid in that valley. Bridge stays. Adams is gone and Kirkwood is gone. Thomas Heavey is a single fragile name in the record, and the other 800 men are not even that. The New York and Erie Railroad itself, once the longest in the world, went bankrupt more than once, and finally vanished into other companies. Its name now just a piece of railroad history. The Staruka Viaduct is still down there in the valley near Lanesboro, 17 arches of bluestone, exactly where they were set, still carrying the weight of trains 170-some years after the last block went up. Wooden trestles that every sensible railroad built instead of stone are all long gone, rotted and burned and replaced and forgotten, dozens of times over. The expensive, stubborn, permanent stone bridge is still at work. I went looking for the names of the men who built it, the way I always do, and the way I almost always come up short. There is Adams, there is Kirkwood, there is the single fragile mention of Thomas Heavey, and then there is a number, 800, standing in for 800 lives that the record could not be bothered to write down. They came out of a famine, crossed an ocean, and spent a year of their lives building one of the most durable structures in the history of this country, and the thanks they got was $1 a day, and for too many of them, an unmarked grave. The viaduct does not say their names, but it says very clearly that they were here, and that they were good at what they did, because it is still standing, still working, still exactly plumb, more than 17 decades after they walked away from it. In the end, that is the only signature most of these men ever got. The work itself, still doing its job, is the only monument they were ever given. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We are often told that the old way of building by hand in stone was slow and wasteful, and that the modern way, fast and cheap and replaceable, is the smarter one. Look at the Staruka Viaduct and tell me which one was really smarter. The Erie spent a fortune in a year to build one bridge out of stone in 1848, and it has carried trains for the better part of 2 centuries without being replaced once. A wooden trestle would have been cheaper that year, and would have been rebuilt 5 or 6 times since, at far greater cost in the end. The men who built for permanence look extravagant in the moment and wise across the century. 800 Irishmen and 2 engineers built a thing in 1 year that has outlasted the railroad that ordered it, the company that paid for it, and every single person who ever doubted it was worth the price. I think that is the better way to build. The trains crossing it tonight seem to agree. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.